As soon as I saw the end screen of Recreator's opening, I had some misgivings. This was a show that, in its first episode, covered some interesting ideas and had made significant ground in both terms of plot and characters that I was quite excited for and impressed with. But this number of characters, all standing in a line and being given this sort of emphasis, well, very few 22 episode series are able to juggle this number of characters. Of course, that doesn't mean that it would necessarily be impossible for Recreators to give each of them the emphasis that they deserve. So in my mind, I was certain that Recreators could be a great show from the outset, so long as its time was used well. Boy, was I disappointed. Episode 2 and 3 of this series are full of wasted time and wasted potential, which basically amount to just massive info dumps, wherein Meteora speaks about some philosophical ideas and the nature of an artist's relationship to their art and the world's relationship to that art. Are these sometimes interesting ideas? Yes. However, in these scenes, the show overcommunicates to its viewers at every turn, giving the impression that the creators wanted to assume the viewer's intelligence, but just didn't know if it was safe to. And all of this led to me thinking, man, Recreators needs a rewrite. The first episode of Recreators is very good. I actually quite love its opening moments wherein we see how elements of fiction permeate the world and how easy it is for creators' self-worth to get tied up in the reception and attention that their art gains. I love how we see elements of so many of the characters we're going to be introduced to later, some more subtle and some less subtle, but all of them important and natural. Here the audience is treated as intelligent and attentive, and the show is at its best in these moments. It is never said to us explicitly that this girl here is someone who is trying to make her own art and it's not quite working out for her. All of that is relayed to us by the juxtaposition of this girl who is all alone and about to commit suicide with the art and stories of successful people. Next, we're introduced to our very plain protagonist named Sota. He narrates for a bit, which is fine, but this scene of him up in his bedroom is once again great. We see the works of fiction all around his room as he turns on his computer to try and draw something. He stares at the screen blankly, before giving up and going to look at other people's more successful art. As someone who dreams of making a story that many people will enjoy and love, I could immediately relate to this young man's feelings. And no one needed to tell me how he felt. I was shown how he felt, through the repeated shots and the monotony of the situation. He's bored with his own art. He doesn't know what to do with his own art. It's tricky for him to feel motivated when he sees such good art out in the world. We get the sense that this is routine for him, that he sits in front of this computer quite frequently and just stares at the screen like this. This is where I really started to think, this could get good. Then there's this quiet swell of the background music as Sota is transported to a fantasy world. The way that his world is creatively intermingled with the other fantasy world is great. The creators of this show could have very easily done something far less interesting to show this moment, and I have a great amount of respect for them for giving this moment so much power and emphasis in order to powerfully contrast it with the previous monotony of Sota's life. The conversation between Sota and Celestia gives us a deeper understanding of both characters on some level, and we are explicitly told about some elements of Sota's desires, which we were already shown more subtly. However, these elements come up quite naturally in their conversation, considering the circumstances of the conversation. We also get to see some funny moments of Celestia not understanding how Sota's world works, such as trying to use a weapon in the car and just activating windshield wipers instead. There are more dynamic fights later on, great animation, and so on. So I think you get the point. The first episode is really good. In fact, it might be great. And as someone who has far less experience than these people do with storytelling, I honestly don't know much of what I would have changed with this episode. They did a fantastic job. However, the very last scene of this episode begins to show some of the problems that are going to plague the next two episodes. And by some of the problems, I really just mean Meteora, or however you say her name. Her personality is incredibly bland, and she only serves to dump exposition, philosophical ideas, and information about the plot and the world on the viewer. Like here, where she talks about how Sota could doubt their existence, or could doubt his own existence entirely at this point based on what is happening to him. In my mind, it was pretty clear that his character is probably struggling with this, or already has struggled with it, or that he is going to struggle with it. Considering that a whole lot of nothing happens in the next couple episodes, some of that time could have even been used to explore this idea if the show's creators and writers had really wanted to. One of the worst examples of this wasted time is in the first scene of the second episode, where Meteora says things like, "So in this world media exists, it even describes extremely personal experiences. And then Celestia joins in and starts talking to Sota about how there is a story out there that describes Meteora's existence, too. As the audience, we already know this, and Sota already knows this too. So I can't help but wonder why this is being talked about at all. It's essentially an info dump for ideas that we already know, assuming that we've watched the first episode. Maybe the writers wanted to make the series approachable if somebody hadn't seen the first episode? I don't know. Regardless, it immediately had me a bit nervous for what was going to come in this episode. Then the characters go and sit in a knockoff McDonald's and talk more about the fact that Meteora is from a story. And she gives her thoughts about why fiction is colliding with reality. But do these things really matter? We already know most of it, and what we don't know explicitly is going to be shown to us in future episodes, or we could have just discerned it ourselves. One bit of info she gives us is about the villain's plan, or at least part of it, saying that the villain told her that she wants to exert influence over their creators. Now, instead of another scene like this where they're sitting around talking, why couldn't we have just started off the episode by actually seeing Meteora and this villain's conversation? The show is going to heavily break from Sota's experiences later on, and we're going to see things that he doesn't see. So it's not like the show is trying to restrict itself to being bound to Sota's perspective throughout. The first 10 minutes of this episode almost provide us with no new information about the show's plot or its characters. Do we learn small things here and there? Sure. Like that Meteora eats a lot of food. But character quirks like these hardly matter at this point in the stage, and they could just be shown to us at pretty much any moment. The first important moment of this episode happens about 13 minutes in, when Celestia meets her creator. Here we're introduced to her creator, obviously, as well as Mamika. If this episode has anything interesting to show the audience, it's Mamika, and how coddling children through simple no-pain plots might not be the best thing. This idea isn't shoved in our faces, that much is for sure. But so much else throughout this episode is that it's honestly hard to care at this point, even when the action picks up and interesting things start to happen. At the end of this episode, we're briefly introduced to Yuya, who is one of the more interesting characters in the series, at least in my mind. He's not a groundbreaking character or anything like that, but he's definitely got some stuff going on. His morals aren't cut and dry, he has a bit of intrigue, he seems like a bit of an ass, but he's genuinely willing to help people out, and his design really accentuates his personality quite perfectly. But in the third episode, we're almost immediately thrown into yet another info dump scene, where all these creations talk about meeting the villain yet again. This idea can be mentioned, but it shouldn't be the focus of one of the many cafe scenes littered throughout the show. There's a good reason that writers should avoid these sorts of settings. They facilitate boring conversations about things we already know, or they facilitate conversations about things we don't know but should have been shown in a more interesting way. So at about 9.5 minutes into this episode, the cafe scene ends and we've wasted a lot of this episode yet again. To be fair, some of this time was used fairly well because we got a better understanding of Yuya's character and his motivations. But those two things could have been shown to us in a more interesting setting and in a more interesting way. The rest of this episode is pretty much spent on trying to test how much the creators can change their creations, and how difficult it is to cause genuine change to the characters' descriptions now that they're in our world. The characters realize that there's an element of influence in this, and that they can't just make a picture and write an excerpt. All in all, they narrow down what they may be able to change about their characters and how they are going to go about that. But it takes them so long to get to this point, which is mainly because Meteora just keeps going on about random stuff. It takes them until about 19 minutes into the third episode before they figure out what I just described about the creator's influence over their creations. I understand that this is an important point to hit, but there's no way that this should have taken so long to get to, and if it is important, again, it should have been shown in a more interesting way. So it becomes very clear, very fast, that this show is not going to be using all of its time that well, and considering the large cast of characters we need to become familiar with, this is a huge problem. That line of characters shown at the end of the opening could have been explored adequately, and they are sometimes explored in some interesting ways as the series progresses. But with so much of the time being thrown away, it seems like the creators of this show bit off a bit more than they could chew with all of these ideas. At many moments in the show, both in these episodes and going forward, I feel like I'm experiencing the first draft of a really interesting show with a ton of potential. Perhaps it's because of rushed production schedules that anime usually have, but to be honest, I don't really know what happened, and I don't want to assume anything on the creator's behalf. For all I know, this was what they wanted and this was what they intended, and it just didn't resonate with me. Despite my criticisms of their work, I have a ton of respect for the work that they do and the amount of effort that they put in and the amount of time that they put into their craft. It's really easy for me to sit here and criticize it, I recognize that much. But I think that this is an important conversation to have because of how many shows lessen the impact of their very interesting and good ideas by writing this way. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, remember to like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at @thelowestart if you feel so inclined. I'm going to start doing some polls there for what future videos will be, so that might be fun. Please let me know down in the comments about your opinion of Recreators if you've seen it. I love discussing these sorts of things with all of you in the comments. Thanks again, and I hope that you have a great day. Bye-bye.